Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's show, we break down the steps to decarbonizing transportation with Amy Myers-Jaffe. Amy is a research professor and the managing director of the Climate Policy Lab at Tufts University. She's also a successful author with a brand new book that will be available for order online on May 11th, 2021. It's called Energy's Digital Future and is published by Columbia University Press. She joined us to discuss what it's going to take to decarbonize personal transportation and long-haul freight, how fast it could happen, and what it will mean for Alberta's and Canada's economy and infrastructure. We also get a sneak peek at some of the content of Amy's new book. Now on to the show. Hello and welcome everyone to episode 15 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my usual webinar co-hosts, Sarah Hastings-Simon and David Keith. So today's episode is one that we've been excited about for a long time now, and not just because of the topic, but also because of today's very special guest. So today's topic is decarbonizing transportation. We'll be tackling questions like how fast can we decarbonize transportation? How much will be electrified versus other solutions? What's going to be the impact of change? And importantly, what will the transition mean geopolitically for oil-producing jurisdictions like the US, Canada, and here in Alberta? And we'll talk not just about personal transportation, but we're also going to talk about long-haul trucking or long-haul freight as well. And today's guest is Amy Myers-Jaffe, and we're very excited to have her on Energy versus Climate. I got to know Amy in the United Arab Emirates, of all places. Back in the mid-2010s, I sat on a World Economic Forum committee that Amy chaired that was looking at the future of the oil and gas industry. It might have been the most distinguished committee that I personally ever served on. We had current and ex-CEOs, industry CEOs from around the world. We had academic chairs, we had representatives from Chatham House, the Woodrow Wilson Institute, the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, all around the table. So chairing us, as Amy did, was like herding cats. And that was whether we are in our little cramped committee meeting room or over lavish UAE state dinners while we sipped orange Fanta. So back then, if you've been to the UAE, you know why we're sipping orange Fanta, not wine or beer. Back then, Amy was the head of the energy program at the University of California, Davis. She is currently research professor and managing director of the Climate Policy Lab at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. She was formerly director of the program on energy security and climate change for the Council of Foreign Relations. And she's a successful author with a brand new book that will be available in fine bookstores everywhere. And by fine bookstores everywhere, I mean Amazon, and that's on May 11th. Her book is called Energy's Digital Future, and it's published by Columbia University Press. And I'm sure in today's conversation, we'll get a sneak peek at some of its content. So welcome, Amy, to Energy versus Climate.
Thank you for having me, Ed, and David and Sarah, great to see you.
Let's get to the first poll and the first question for Amy. So the first audience poll, it's a little different from what we normally do. We want to know personally, what are your personal plans regarding electric vehicles? You see the options there. So pick your own, choose your own adventure here, what your plans are. Now, let's get the conversation going with Amy. So going back to that World Economic Forum committee that we were on, David, Sarah, and I were Albertans, and so as you can imagine, the future of oil and gas is of keen interest to us, and it's also a reoccurring theme on our show. So back when we were on that committee, we looked at, and we actually quoted in one of our white papers, a report by the group you used to run, the energy program at UC Davis that said several emerging factors, efficiency technologies for advanced vehicles, logistics planning and freight, changes in urban transport patterns that cap personal vehicle ownership and congestion, and slower than expected economic growth in key Asian economies could bring a temporary peak of oil demand in transport in the next decade or so. And that is, of course, a quote. Well, back then, of course, we can be forgiven for missing COVID as an emerging factor. But now that we're 5 years out, what is your prediction for peak demand? And what are the key drivers behind peak demand?
Well, I think that our original study from the WEF is looking much more accurate now, maybe even at the time it was released. And, part of that's COVID. But one of the things that COVID shows us is that some of these new adventures like e-commerce and telecommuting have hit a lot faster than our panel might have been assuming 5 years ago. And so we are seeing not only some of those technologies that can be oil eliminating hit, but also that we have new trends that are sort of put in motion by COVID. So, for example, you mentioned electric cars. Last year, 2020, globally, car sales were down almost 15% from normal. But EV sales were way up, especially in China and Europe. So, again, telling us something about the trend. And we now have vehicle miles traveled in the United States. We're the car culture country, of the world. And VMT this year is down. Last year was down 14%, which is, pretty significant. I'm sure many people who are listening to the podcast have seen that in Canada and in other places, that traffic in the urban setting is a lot less. I think one of the things that's now an open question, of course, is with COVID, maybe our presumptions that we had in 2015 in that time frame about mass transit and its role has to be revisited because mass transit's taken a huge beating with people not feeling safe to use mass transit in major cities. Got you.
So if we think of, again, going back to where we were back in 2010, half of the world's population lived in cities. We think by 2050, 75% of the population will live in cities. So we really tried to look at changes in urban transport patterns as well. We also, back then, were looking at IEA data that suggested we're going to add 1 billion more cars on the road between now and 2030. So coming out of COVID, with vehicle miles traveled down 14% and car sales down, although EVs up, we'll add more EVs. And based on our poll results, it's interesting, 60% of our respondents said, my next car purchase will likely be an EV. So we have high interest in buying EVs. But do we think we've flattened that curve on total car ownership compared to what we were thinking 5 years ago?
Well, unfortunately, we have these competing trends. So one of the things that's happened since we did our original study, which I've modeled, is that more and more jurisdictions, including jurisdictions in Canada, are saying we're setting a date for which in my jurisdiction you can no longer sell a gasoline combustion engine car. So you have that in British Columbia. Now California has weighed in and said 2035. The UK, France, China have all set up plans to end the sales of gasoline and diesel vehicles. So that's really substantive in terms of policy. The problem is, depending on where, you have more people who are afraid to use mass transit. So you have these two competing trends. Something like 30% of Americans, I don't know the statistic for Canada, but 30% of Americans are working from home now. That's up from 6%. I think a lot of that could wind up being more permanent than we think. Air travel is down substantially. So in the United States, commuting was 16% of all oil demand. If 30% of people aren't commuting, that's a lot. But you have this flip side, which is if I'm living in a smaller city and I'm going to do something, do I have to drive farther to go to the bank? We're having less people in the so-called walking lifestyle. Ride sharing was a negative in terms of oil use, that we had these people cruising around looking for people to take, on a lesson and on a trip. And they were, people were not pooling. They were just literally getting in a car with the driver here in the United States. But in China, it was leading to a lot of carpooling. So again, ride sharing use worldwide is down something like 80%. So the question is, when we come out of COVID, what are the policies we're going to be putting in place? And that's a subject I cover intensely in my book, because we need things like tailpipe emission rules for ride sharing firms. And we need to think about, fleets, whether that's corporate fleets or the post office fleet, that the Biden administration's looked at, or whether that's how we handle 18-wheelers. The EU is looking at that carefully in California. What are the regulations going to be that keep us on the path to having sustainability across the vehicle fleet in all forms?
Let's turn to Sarah and David, and let's keep on this futurist trend. And I should disclose, I'm personally not a futurist, and generally when I make predictions, they're wrong. But let's look ahead. So Sarah, give us your sense of how different will the future transportation system look, and then talk about how do we get there from here, and maybe comment specifically on, will it be mode shifting? When you look ahead, are we going to be getting around by hoverboards or hyperloops instead of, personal cars, whether they be EVs or internal combustion engine cars? Or is it going to be through fuel switching basically liquid fuels for electrons?
Yeah, I'm imagining, I think I'm going back to the Jetsons where we're all going around in flying cars. I don't know that that's going to happen. But I think that, I think the answer is really all of the above. I think there's some, clearly a role for fuel switching, and there's some things that, the car as it's designed now, but with an electric engine instead of an internal combustion engine, does pretty well, these kind of, mid and longer distance trips. But I do think that electrification opens up a range of different options in terms of the types of vehicles that we're using. And part of that is really how, the fact that an electric motor and the battery are relatively scalable in a way that an internal combustion engine isn't. And so, for me, a big one is things like e-bikes or these other smaller mobility vehicles that have, some kind of electric engine so that you're not having to, power yourself completely. And, full disclosure, I'm a big e-bike fan. I own 2 of them and I use them quite a bit. But I think that it's more than just kind of a interesting little curious trend, but it's really about this ability to scale the powertrain, to scale the motor in a way that's very different, right? And so that I think becomes quite important. I think we're just starting to see the uptake there, and it is going to take a little while because when you're talking about really mode shifting, and especially into modes that are new, it's a lot easier for consumers, I think, to wrap their head around. Okay, well, I own an internal combustion engine. I know what it's like to have a car. An EV is a big step, no question, but at least it fits into sort of a specific category that I know. And some of this new modes of transportation are going to be very different, and that's going to take some time. But just as we saw, back a century ago with a rise of internal combustion engines, if you have something that delivers a service that people are interested in, over time there will be an uptake. So I think that both will ultimately be important. It's in the US, at least 48% of trips are below 3 miles that are taken currently by car. And about 20% of those are below a mile. So, obviously we're not going to be replacing riding our e-bikes on 100-mile journeys, but there's a lot of these trips that can be changed. And that starts to have a follow-on effect for how the infrastructure, the road infrastructure and things like that are built as well too. So I think there's a potential to see a lot of that change, and this collision, really, frankly, of COVID coming at a time when there's a shift or growth in the attention paid to decarbonizing transportation, I think has the potential to accelerate that faster, because it really created this big disruption in kind of the way we do things. And that, I think, is, that behavioral element is really quite important when you look at, we're all creatures of habit. And so, I think coming out of that, if there are new ways for us to get around, that's exactly the moment, for a marketer, that's exactly what you want, is some sort of change in someone's life so that they go and do something different.
Great. David, let's get you in.
I want to pick up on exactly that. Total agreement, but not so clear which direction it goes, at least for total energy use. So I really wonder about some rebound effects coming out of COVID. So natural thought is, if we can work from home and do more on Zoom, then of course energy use goes down. Well, maybe. But if the fact that we're working from home mostly, only going to the office occasionally, means that many of us choose to have homes that are a lot further from our offices or more out in the exurbs, and there's a lot of evidence that's already happening. The Economist had a frontline article about real estate prices in a bunch of developed countries showing price rises outside cities. So if that happens, and at the same time, if we have a move towards autonomous vehicles that reduce the kind of mental cost of driving, so it's easy to work and do other stuff while you drive, that may tend to drive emissions. Depend on how we power the vehicles, but it may tend to drive VMT and energy use up. And, lest you think that I'm just kind of making this up, think about how the transatlantic telegram, this amazing instantaneous technology across the Atlantic, did that drive travel up or down? How about the telephone? Think carefully before you assume that because you can communicate easily, that means that you do less travel, because it means you have more distant connections who you want to travel to. So you may do less fraction of your business by traveling, but more total travel. And I also think there's really interesting rebounds technologically that come from the batteries and the motors and the control systems that we're using for electric vehicles. I have no idea. I'm not investing. I'm just guessing. But I don't think, contrary to what Sarah said, I don't think the idea of this short distance electric flying vehicles is ridiculous. I think that there really is a kind of mode shift where we understand the reasons helicopters cost so much, but that something that really is a kind of drone technology that is much more fault tolerant and fundamentally cheaper to build may actually tunnel through in a way that then allows a big increase in total travel distances and energy use. So bottom line, I think I agree with Sarah that this is a time of disruption. It's really hard to say, but I caution against the natural assumption that this tends to drive energy use down.
Great.
No, so, I have to intervene. I want
you to intervene, but I want to put a specific question to you, Amy. So talk about the rebound effect, but that UC Davis study we looked at, you projected back then that through things like smartphone applications, big data analytics, IT software that's going to optimize routing, that back then you said we're going to push barrel consumption of oil down by 12 billion barrels between now and 2030. Do you think that's still accurate? Okay, now over to you.
Okay, so now my colleagues at UC Davis and I have taken it to the next level, and we added in some people from Columbia.
Okay.
So new modeling. We did we had multiple scenarios. Some of them were some of these sad scenarios that David's talking about, where we're just using more and using more. But we did one scenario I call it the Amy Jaffe scenario. We call it forced revitalization. And that is the green stimulus scenario, right? Where everybody from Joe Biden's administration to the Chinese to the Europeans have these green energy push, and it affects transport. And we have a lot of innovation, including, let me just say, chapter in the book, cities with smart vehicles, right? So you're not going to have we're imagining in our minds because it's very hard to get out of the paradigm of our current behavior. But as Sarah says, maybe we have different behaviors. So, one behavior is we get a self-driving car, our Tesla self-drives or our Ford self-drives, and therefore we can live 2 hours from our office because we're just going to read a book when we're in traffic commuting. But the other paradigm is that we don't own a car and that we are in a city or we're in our destination and there's especially in a geo-fenced area, especially in a small city or even in a place like New York City in Midtown, right? We're going to have this fleet of self-driving vehicles that can pick up multiple people or one person and move them around, and they're synchronized with the traffic system and with crossings. And so there's a huge efficiency gain because they're not 100 people making decisions. It's a 5G launch system where every vehicle is timed. If you're say you're in New York City, you come out of the subway and you've taken that, which is of course electrified. You get out, there's some vehicle waiting for you because you pushed your app and it knew what time you're arriving to take you the 15 blocks that you're going, right? All synchronized, big hacking opportunity, but all synchronized. Yeah. And then within that system, there are places like Dubai that are already experimenting with having rooftop drone-to-drone service. So if you were, again, by analogy, in Toronto downtown or in New York City downtown, and you wanted to go from one part of downtown to another, and that would normally take you an hour in traffic, now you can go take the elevator up to the launch pad, get in a 20-person drone, and be shuttled. Yep. And then when we're doing it, people are talking about doing that to get around the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. So it's here.
It's not crazy.
That technology is here.
But going back to Dubai, because I remember
but here's the projection.
Okay.
That scenario mapped out takes oil demand down to 90 million barrels a day by 2030, right? So in that scenario that we modeled at UC Davis and Columbia, we bring it creates a permanent peak in oil demand in 2025 and then a steady rate down. And that is the scenario where we didn't have intensive government regulation, right? So if you were to add government regulation to it, I think it'd be a pretty powerful scenario in terms of eliminating oil demand.
Gotcha. Going back to the self-driving vehicle example, what I worry about is that we humans are great at hacking optimized systems. So yes, you can be emerging from the subway and saying, I want my vehicle to pick me up at 10:15, but you bump into your friend along the way and you tell your vehicle, just wait 15 minutes for me. And then that vehicle, which can't park, is circling until you finish your conversation and then you jump in. And that's why I wonder, like David, or worry about the rebound effect.
But to be clear, rebound.
But that's where the algorithm comes in, because once I cancel that car and I say, come back for me in 15 minutes, that car is deployed to someone else. That is the power of the device.
So two quick points. I mean, one, of course, is that in lots of cases, improved efficiency has led to increased demand, not decrease. So the assumption that efficiency sort of decreases demand. And the other one is really the divergence of oil and transportation energy use. So I kind of believe you. I agree with you that I think that transportation oil use is really going to peak and head down. But transportation energy use, I've been responding to something on Twitter that Steve Davis asked about, scenarios where we get a tripling of global energy demand by 2050. I think there are scenarios like that, and they involve a lot of transportation.
I think that's where the policy also has a role to play, because David, as you're right, we're sort of at this moment where change can come. And if you leave it up to, simply the market, who knows what we're going to get. But the extent to which you have policymakers who are looking at this saying, okay, we want to layer on rules around decarbonization to how these systems are created. So, for example, self-driving cars is certainly something within the space that policymakers can regulate. I think that is the question of, to what extent they are going to impose rules that prevent some of this runaway demand growth.
Okay, Sarah, carry on with that. Let's say the policymakers do impose those rules. Let's say we get the kind of forced revitalization that Amy is talking about, the Jaffe scenario, the green stimulus scenario. How fast can we shift away from internal combustion engines? So I think we're going to launch our second poll here to allow people to weigh in. But how fast will we shift away? And let's disaggregate between personal vehicles and freight. What's your prediction?
So I think one thing I would preface it with is, like always in every single decarbonization conversation, we spend an enormous amount of time talking about the last 20% and how it's so hard to decarbonize this car that's going to drive this far and so on and so forth. And so I think that's important here as well. So the ability to decarbonize, something like over half of the cars that exist in and around cities today without very much more work of putting in, some charging stations, maybe people being able to rent a car when they want to travel a long distance. I think that's something that we can, more or less do now. And if you look at some other countries that have, are further along on this pathway, I should have looked up the exact numbers, but, I think Norway was like 8 to 12 years to go from, a few percent to almost 80% of new vehicles purchased being EVs. So I think that can go quite quickly, especially as we have this confluence of the number of vehicle models coming out, dramatically growing, and the price is dropping. And so it's no longer you go to the store and you look for an EV and it's like, do you want this one car or not? But you're looking for a car. It happens to be an EV and it meets all your needs, and it's not really more expensive up front. I think that's sort of the magical moment those can change over. And then within freight, I think as well, too, we're seeing, some big forces behind that around companies like Amazon and Walmart having set quite aggressive electrification targets. So I think they're looking at where our poll is coming in. I think the 2040, the extent to which you could get some of those older cars off the road even sooner, I believe you could get down into the 2030s with half the world's road vehicles. But yeah, so maybe I'll leave it there.
Okay,
I think you're smoking crack. I think you're thinking about here, where in which countries I agree, but think about
people
Africa, think about a bunch of Central Asia.
15 years.
All right. Well, let's. So we've answered that one. David, Amy have answered that one quickly. Let's see. Our audience said 55% say half of the world's road vehicles will be EVs by 2040. That is not coincidentally when we looked at all those low growth scenarios in that WEF committee. Most of them were bullish on EVs, and many of them suggested it'd be about 2040 globally would see 50% of the cars being electric. But still, let's be clear, to do that, we need far more cars rolling off of assembly lines today to be electric than they are currently. And while I see more and more Teslas where I live in Canmore, Alberta, it's still a fraction of the cars on the road today. And I haven't toured a car manufacturer.
More to the point, because we're not advertising Tesla. Yeah. You can't even name the brand of 5 other brands of electric car just off the top of your head. You can't just say, oh, and then there's the blah, blah model.
Volkswagen.
But what's the name of the car?
Volkswagen.
The Volkswagen what?
I'm joking.
ID4, but I spent a lot
of time. The Electrobug. Okay.
But remember, our poll was for road vehicles, not cars. I think it is important to say that outside North America, cars are a smaller fraction, more in the 40s.
But we need to get the cost of an EV battery down to a third of, let's say, what it was a couple of years ago. Yeah. And isn't a big factor we need China to go big on EVs?
And it is.
China goes big. But is every manufacturer following suit? Because I thought that was the biggest driver of EV deployment, is that those billion cars, new cars, are going to have between now and 2030. A chunk of them are going to happen in brick companies, with China being the leader. But David, you're saying
the companies have pivoted. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is really, truly, it gets back to what David said. Am I going to live somewhere, and am I going to move to what I call the access lifestyle, right? I'm going to live somewhere where I work, or I'm going to work from home, my grocery store, my local cleaner, everything's going to be walking distance or short distance. And I'm not going to be doing these extreme, drives except on holiday.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think the question is, how are people going to live? And I think that that's a generational question.
And as Sarah said, a policy question. I think the point is that technology alone doesn't tell you the answer. And I think you can conceive of these technologies giving you big increases in vehicle miles traveled or big decreases. And I think, as Sarah said, we need policy.
Okay, let's go. I want another last question, but a big one, and then we'll go to audience questions. So it's this geopolitical question. What does the future, given the scenarios that we've talked about over the last basically 25 minutes, now put on your futurist hat again. What does it mean for oil producing jurisdictions like the US, Canada, and subnational jurisdictions like Alberta? What does it mean in terms of demand? If we go down to 90 million barrels per day of demand, what strategies and policies do these jurisdictions need to take in order to still be relevant as we're seeing demand for the product shrink worldwide? Amy, why don't you weigh in?
Listen, I don't like to come to Canada and be a naysayer, but there are going to be two real big things, one of which Canada is doing and one of which is going to be unbelievably hard. So in the future, there will, we're talking about eliminating oil demand. We're not talking about getting it to zero. So, in any kind of time frame that matters, not in the next 10 years, maybe not even the next 20 years. So the question is, how carbon intensive is your oil production and your natural gas production? What are your environmental practices? Because, we're learning about social justice and impact on communities, right? So I'm concerned about not only your methane emissions and your 1, 2, and scope 3 emissions from the process, but I want to know how you're affecting water, how you're affecting the carbon sink of forest and so forth, right? So there's multiple metrics I think that are going to come forward. And you've got countries, Canada's been in a competition with Saudi Arabia, and it's not always been pretty for Canadian workers. Saudi Arabia is a concerted policy to try to decarbonize its oil production. So if Canada doesn't do that, big problem. Second problem, Saudi Arabia can do that, and someday if it has to sell its oil for $5 a barrel or $6 a barrel, they might have trouble getting their economy to run on that, but they won't have a problem that the oil is just be sold at a loss because their costs are so high. So how does Canada, which is a high-cost producer, compete in a future world where you have to both decarbonize your oil production to make it as environmentally performing as possible when there's going to be carbon border tariffs, around the world for people's oil and gas purchases? And at the same time, you're going to be in a much more competitive landscape in terms of price. Could be a very competitive landscape on price. As demand falls away, prices might look different than they are today.
And Amy, quick follow-on question. So Saudi is decarbonizing its oil. Saudi is no stranger to launching price wars, as it did in the price war with Russia over its OPEC plus spat about a year ago. Will Saudi be using that as a tactic going forward as it decarbonizes? Like it will decarbonize and then just try to get as much of the oil share as possible at the same time?
It's very hard to predict. Right now, they seem to be, money is the option. There's financial needs, and those financial needs are overcoming the sort of long-term concern about markets and market share. So right now, Saudi Arabia doesn't look like it's on the brink of, dipping the prices down. They're in the opposite mode. In fact, for those of you who are like in the weeds of, energy diplomacy, the U.S. Secretary of Energy just made a little statement about her call with the Saudi oil minister about affordable oil prices. So, guess what? We're in COVID. People are trying to do recoveries. We don't want super high oil prices. But I do think that in the long term, we have to worry about what some economists call the green paradox, right? Which is that I see regulations coming that regulation is going to be more and more stringent over time. So I have to get my carbon assets, used and spent while I still have a window to sell them. Mm-hmm. And that could be bad news for Canada vis-a-vis the Middle East producers deciding that they're going to get as much out of the ground now while they can.
Sarah, David, we've talked about this. It's also been a reoccurring theme, what it means for Alberta, based on what we've talked about today. And I know we've spoken about it in the past couple of shows. What do you think? What are you most worried about as Albertans?
I think it's, as you say, it's sort of a theme we're coming back to often, but it's what is the impact on Alberta's economy of not a complete, erasure of the demand for oil, but of a significant decrease. And I think that is in terms of jobs within the province and in terms of the revenue from the resource sales, it is significant potentially before you go all the way to zero oil demand or something like that.
Okay. David, unless you want to weigh in, why don't we get to audience questions? So I know Eva is working to line up a live question, but let's go to this first one from Ed Brost. Hello, Ed. Ed, by the way, and I hope you don't mind me disclosing, former executive in the energy sector. Does the transition to EVs need to be complete before impacting oil prices? Could a partial transition to electrified transport impact oil prices even before peak demand occurs?
Let me take that one.
Yeah,
and, fabulous question. And really, we're already seeing that happen. And how is it happening? Markets anticipate things that are going to happen. So today you have banks that say, I'm not going to finance new oil fields, or I'm not going to finance new development because I feel like there's not going to be a market for it in the future. But it also has this deterrent effect in the following way. You can have a short-term disruption. We just had that, mega problem in the Suez Canal and prices were a little uplifted. But if prices go up for some period of time, we now know what we would do. Maybe we'd telecommute more. Maybe we would let it be Amazon's problem and we wouldn't drive to the store. We let Amazon algorithm us to a more efficient fuel use. Maybe we would carpool now because we have the app. Right? So the market's ability to respond to a high energy input from oil is much higher now. We can implement efficiency almost instantaneous, using our smartphones. So the market power that oil producers have, in my opinion, is already eliminated. And then on top of that, you have the sort of flexibility that if suddenly it looked like something happened and the price of oil was going to stay at $60 for 3 weeks, everybody and their brother, I don't care what people say, you're already seeing guys coming out to the Permian Basin in Texas and they're drilling again, drilling, because, that's just the way it is. So that production is going to show up in 3 to 6 months. And, whatever price we're seeing now, the impact of that drilling could be, potentially impactful down the road.
There's just two things that I would add to that, sort of to further the same point that Amy's making. So one is also to remember that there's a big range in the number of miles or kilometers that are driven by different vehicles. And so when we're talking about, fleet-wide decisions around or fleet-wide percentages of electrification, that can well be hiding, if we end up electrifying delivery vehicles that are driving a lot of miles in a day, that can have quite a big impact. There's some evidence around two-car households, for example, also where when they have one car that's an EV or a hybrid, because of the lower cost of ownership, lower cost of operation, that car then tends to be driven more. So certainly it's not necessarily a linear impact between the percentage of vehicles that are EVs and the vehicle miles traveled by EVs. So I think that's an important one to remember. And then the second one is also, I think that consumers are going to be relatively price sensitive to what happens with gasoline prices and choices around their next vehicle purchase, right? And that's a little bit, we might say it's a little irrational. It shouldn't really matter what the price is at the pump today when you go to buy your car. You should try to understand what the price will be over the next 15 years, and maybe it will come back down again. But I think there's a lot of evidence that, consumers do not make car purchase decisions that way. They're very, we see that bigger cars with less good gas mileage get purchased when the gasoline price drops. And, so there's, I think, going to be a little bit of a natural correcting factor as well, too, as we move forward now, that if the price of oil starts to rise, if the price of gas starts to rise, then you may see more consumers actually choosing to purchase an EV as well in a short period of time.
Okay, let's go to another question. This is from Kelly Cantwell. With widespread EV adoption, what sort of investment will be required in the electricity transmission and distribution systems to allow the system to function seamlessly? So, couple of things, or a few points of context. Amy, we've talked a lot about electricity on this program, including where it makes sense to produce, say, renewable electricity, where it doesn't. The second one is we have a very controversial gigawatt scale new hydro project happening in Northeast BC that seems like it's going to be a white elephant upon delivery. But by some estimates, as we electrify mobility and heat, we're going to need to triple Canada's electricity supply. So take a Site C dam and, by tripling supply, we're like talking about 20 new Site C dams. And I don't think people are prepared for that. The third one, and Amy, I heard you on another podcast commenting on this. We just had the collapse of an energy system, not because of renewables, but in Texas. And so now we're talking about the shift from EVs, putting new loads on systems. And a state like Texas did not a capacity market, did not have that buffer that, say, a state in California has in order to pull in electricity from other jurisdictions when it needs to. So those three pieces of context, what do we need to do to change our grids while we're seeing more widespread adoption of EVs?
Well, transmission. Easy to say, hard to do, especially as an American. Let me just say, a lot of talk about going to 100% renewables in the United States without the understanding that all the places that have been successful doing that, or a lot of them, have done so successfully, like Vermont, by buying Canadian hydro. And even California's plans to go to 100% renewables and have an entire fleet of tens of millions of EVs would be, in my opinion, based on Northwest and Canadian hydro, right? Because hydro is going to be the new, where it's available. You look at the Nord Pool, in Europe, how is that working? How it's working is we got wind in one place and hydro in another place, and we have demand in another place, and we're balancing all of that by having what we technically call an imbalanced market. What does that mean? We're trading electricity at different times of day and night based on differential resources to make the system work. And, to the extent that we have more smart meter and more automation, it becomes easier to do. If I'm willing to let my utility / regulator, which in Texas, I would definitely not be willing to do it. So we'd have to have a major change there. Mm-hmm. Automatically, I plug my Tesla into my garage, and then it's either providing me electricity or charging itself based on some incredibly automated signal from the grid that's organized well. You have the South Australia project, right, where batteries are like a power plant. So I have a giant, complex of housing, apartments, multi-dwellings, single-family dwellings, and everybody has a little battery like a washing machine in their utility room. And I tell the utility that, or some third-party provider, that you could have 30% of my battery if you need it during a brownout period. Then all of those batteries aggregated are huge. And that becomes a real balancer to tide you through these sort of short-term things. Seasonally, we're going to have some other solution, but this balances market is really, I think, a pivotal thing. And of course, Texas is the one thing they keep saying, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. The one thing they're not saying they're going to do is they're not adding a capacity market within the state to buy excess power to be available in an emergency. And they're not talking about having an imbalanced market with, regional other regional grids or even with Mexico.
Mhm.
And that's a problem, right? Because in the end, the safety comes from being able to tap different grids, and the technology that we need, in my opinion, is transmission wires that minimize, with new materials, minimize the loss, as electricity travels over a farther distance.
All right, David.
No, I think it really is important to distinguish things that are politically hard but technically easy, and things that are actually technically hard, and both matter. So we don't know right now how to decarbonize aircraft easily. It's a true technical problem and a regulatory problem. But long distance transmission, we don't need any new materials. That is, sorry, but no. We know how to build 2,000 or 2,000 plus km long lines that are efficient and cost effective. They're being built today in the real world. You'd have multiple bids. The issue is purely political. I don't want to minimize it, but I also, coming back to some earlier conversations we had on the show, things can change quickly. If the governments in North America and Canada or down to Mexico decide, it's some democratic government strongly elected, they want to build a lot of long distance transmission, you just force permitting. And at some level, national governments do have power. And then you don't need any new materials. In fact, I don't think there's really any new materials that are irrelevant. You just need to build technologies we basically know how to build. And I really do think that's almost the key. So I agree with you. Transmission. Using the hydro resources to manage intermittency and allowing us to get solar, for example, where it's cheap, not where it's expensive. I think that's just crucial. Well, I got it.
And wind, we have wind power at night. So at night means something different in different time zones.
A little bit, that's right. And you can even think about these global transmission architectures that seem a little less likely. I think there are environmental limits to wind, but I want to raise one other thing. Well, I've got a second here, which is how much. So right now, part of the push for EVs is the fact that they're actually fantastic and that there really is new technology that are amazing. Part of it is this complicated change in the technology of transportation. Part of it is climate. If we have on the market, which we don't today, a scalable carbon neutral transportation fuel, and full disclosure, the company I founded, Carbon Sharing, is one pathway to do that. If we have one of those fuels really on the market, I think there will still be lots of EVs because there are lots of places where EVs win, but I think it will change the dynamic a little bit. I'd like to hear what other people think, because right now, without that, the only way to decarbonize is go full EV. But with that, it's going to be a mixture of EVs and whatever this carbon neutral fuel is, powering things that EVs don't do well.
Well, I mean, one interesting opportunity, because everybody's talking about green hydrogen. We're going to make hydrogen from renewables and then put it in a fuel cell vehicle, and that's going to be a solution, especially for larger vehicles.
Or a turbine vehicle.
Right. But, there's this other possibility. If you look at the IPCC, scientific recommendation, we need to go to what I call negative emissions. In other words, we need to be...
Just to stop. No, that was not a recommendation. That was a response to a political ask for a 1.5 target. The scientists who wrote it have been very careful to say that was not a scientific recommendation. Minor point, but it matters.
Oh, okay. But the point is, there's a whole discussion. I will rephrase my point. There's a whole discussion about the benefits. Is that...
many people assert the scientists say we have to cut emissions by X. It just doesn't happen to be what they asserted.
Okay. So point is, in some of the decarbonization pathways, there is a discussion of BECCS, right? So having some kind of a bio-based or other kind of based fuel that actually is negative emissions for carbon, right? When you take the full life cycle, you're actually removing a problem of carbon. So, the most obvious one, which hopefully we would come up with a better solution than this, is that we have in the United States, we have landfills that leach methane into the atmosphere. So if I eliminate all of that methane and then I had a clean way, like with carbon sequestration, to turn that into a fuel, that would be even more beneficial than a green fuel because I would be taking away carbon out of the atmosphere or methane.
And I want to flag a couple things. I want to go to Sarah, then I want to go to another questioner. One is we could do a whole show, and we should do a show on carbon dioxide removal because when it comes to CDR, all the conversation, too much of the conversation up here is on biological sequestration, trees and regenerative soil management and whatnot. We don't talk enough about BECCS, direct air capture, carbon mineralization, ocean-based technologies. Let's park that. We'll have another show. The other one, David, you mentioned aviation. And yeah, let's do a show on that, because last time I checked, it's $600 a ton to try to change out aviation fuel infrastructure to decarbonize it. Sarah, you jump in, and then we're going to go to another questioner.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Kelly's question about what kind of investments required, and take actually David's framing of, differentiating between things that we know how to do, that we just have to do, versus ones that are sort of technologically impossible. And so the kind of investment specifically on the distribution side for EVs is very much just a matter of doing what we know how to do, right? And when we're talking about the amount of electricity demand increase from electrification, it's very much within the range of the demand increases that we, happily met all throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s across North America. So I think that's really important to stress when we think about what we need to do with the distribution systems. The fact that we need to do something sometimes comes across a little bit like, oh, well, there's going to be this problem when we try to integrate all these electric vehicles. That said, we do need to do something, and utilities and distribution utilities and regulators, need to start and are already starting to work on this in terms of both, where are there going to need to be additional, pieces to the distribution system built out, but also how do we create a system that is a smarter use of the electricity and the distribution capacity that we have, so that if you have a level 2 charger in your home, a faster charger, but you only need to charge your car a bit overnight because you've just only been driving it around during the day, then not having you plug in your car at 6 o'clock when everybody else gets home and pulling this high amount of demand at a time when it's not really needed. And so there's quite a lot of flexibility within that charging space, and that would make the demands on the distribution system less. And it's just really a matter of addressing those.
Okay, we've talked a bit about hydro. We have a former hydro industry executive who's got a question. Paul McKendrick, over to you to ask your question, not about hydro, but about internal combustion engines.
Thanks for a great discussion, everyone. My question is, do you think a ban on new sales of internal combustion engines or vehicles makes sense? Or should there be an allowance for combustion vehicles running on clean fuels? And if a ban does make sense, when would you implement that?
Great. And so I want to turn to the panel. Great question. Why ban it when we're on the path to tripling vehicle efficiency? And we could see maybe we'll quadruple vehicle efficiency. Why this haste to phase them out entirely when they could still have a role in personal transportation? Amy, you want to jump in?
Well, there's this, I think, basic feeling of mistrust to the liquid fuel system, right? We've had a lot of false starts. I don't personally, the science is mixed. I'm not very convinced that ethanol is a sustainable fuel, for example, right? When you take into account land use and other uses, other factors that go into its life cycle analysis. So, and then, you have some other solutions that people have talked about as a drop-in or a gaseous fuel. That have some water complications. We don't want to do a repeat of MTBE, the additive we used in the United States to get clean air. And then it turned out we had fabulous performance in clean air, but we turned out to be polluting water all around the United States with that same chemical. So I think there's a trust issue there in terms of, can we or can't we come up with a good drop-in fuel to use the current infrastructure, or could we come up with a gaseous substitute and switch over to, we have natural gas vehicles and LNG vehicles in the US and Canada and Mexico. Could we change that up and put in a different gaseous fuel that would be, higher performing or, possibly negative emissions? I think that the problem is really the complication of conveying to the public, I get 10 options and I'm going to try to do all 10. And I'm going to subsidize all 10 of them versus I got this one solution that you can see because you all know what a Tesla is. And I can take that same Tesla battery and put it on a wind farm and mean that I have backup power. It's I think some of it honestly is just like a communications issue in the policy domain. And there are a lot of people, I'd be interested in David's opinion. I mean, there are a lot of people from the science community who are stepping back now and saying, we need to look at drop-in fuels. Because if we're really going to get where we need to go in the time frame we need to get there, we really need to find a drop-in fuel solution because of the timeline it takes to change out infrastructure.
Yeah. And let's just, let's be frank. It's not just, drivetrain infrastructure to change out all those engines. We don't change cars as quickly as we change smartphones, right? But it's also that refueling infrastructure. Now I look and, it's sexy as all hell, but a stone's throw away from my house, they just put in a Tesla charging station. But that's nothing compared to just within a 5-kilometer radius of where I live, all the liquid fuel refueling station options that I have in my town.
I want to put just a second's caution to Amy about your comment about wind farms and Tesla battery packs. And there was a comment in the chat, somebody's question about using all these cars as a battery for the grid. I think it really is important to say the big grid challenges are going to be seasonal or these kind of week-long scale. And the specific battery technologies we develop for vehicles, which are low capex, but don't do deep discharge and lots of cycles so well, when you do the math, they're really not very economic for energy storage. So that they work for some short-term variability management, but that market gets saturated fast. But I think they really don't make sense for a deep, long-term energy storage. I think there's a lot of modeling that shows that.
So I'm just going to push back on one thing. I mean, I understand what you're saying, understand systems modeling, right? But the reality is in South Australia, they had constant and repeated brownouts. There was no pathway under which building a natural gas pipeline from Western Australia worked. There was no pathway under which bringing around the LNG worked. I mean, I think Canadians can understand that because you have a lot of inefficiency in your geographic location of, think of all the pipelines we've talked about building in Canada that haven't come to fruition. Not going to say the one because we're having not going to go into pipelines today. But, the bottom line is, and you're right, in a place that, it's only light 2 minutes a year, harder to do, but Norway is the most successful place with electric vehicles. But my point to you is, in South Australia, high deployment now of solar, high deployment now of wind, and no brownouts, period. It just has worked.
And there is also the potential for the lithium-ion batteries to ride the coattails of transportation and have a bigger presence in the electricity system than they would otherwise, right? And I think that's exactly what you saw with the silicon PV panels, right? Where if you go back 10 years and you look at the numbers, and even now, it doesn't really make sense, right? In some sense, we should be using, thin film or some of these other technologies, but they just have not been able to compete with the advantage that the silicon PV got from all the other silicon that we're dealing with making in the economy.
Totally agree.
Let me say another thing about how
the big player in storage today in new storage builds is not batteries; it's pump storage.
Yeah, okay, but hear me out. Okay, hear me out. The way PPAs are set up, the battery has to pay for itself by shaving my peak use of electricity, right? And the way David's saying, I'm thinking of it in a short-term way on a daily basis, right? You're telling me I have to spend $5 or $10 million to put this battery system in if I'm a data center or I'm an apartment building, whatever, right? And you're going to tell me in my PPA that I'm going to save, this many cents at 6 p.m. every day or at 12 noon every day, and that the battery is going to pay for itself in X number of years. And so it's not really that attractive. But if I'm a company in Texas, right, and I hope there's someone from Texas listening to this podcast, right? If I'm a company where I've repeatedly lost $100 million because I'm not prepared for hurricanes or I'm not prepared for an ice storm, or some other location, same problem. And I'm repeatedly losing millions of dollars at my company, at my building, at my site, because I didn't have backup power. Then the idea that I could have some system that would automatically recharge my battery, whether that was solar or something else, some kind of generator with some other kind of sustainable fuel, right? Now you're talking, because now it's not about whether I'm going to shave 2 cents from my electricity bill on a particular day. Now I'm going to save myself from climate change events. I'm going to have resilience. And I think that in the United States anyway, the Pentagon is starting to think about it that way. And, I like to remind people, we're in this whole thing in the United States about the wasteful spending on science. You know what? We wouldn't even have GPS. You would not have your smartphone. You would still be with the paper map if the United States government didn't have to track the Sputnik satellite, because that is how GPS was developed. And you would not be in your Tesla, letting go of your hands, even though you're not allowed to, because you want to do something and, hey, it's on cruise control. You wouldn't be doing that, except for the fact that the Pentagon had a contest in the Mojave Desert to make an automated vehicle, I'm sure for military application, right? So this public expenditure in national security, again, plugging my book, because goes through the entire book. I go through the history of it from 1910 to today, right? That public expenditure is looking for these solutions. We need to be looking for solutions to climate resilience, because some of these storms are for an hour. We had a 10-minute cyclone tornado in my town in Connecticut. And some people in the town were without water and electricity for 3.5 weeks. 10-minute event, right? I'm sure all of them, if you could turn it around and say, hey, I guess I should have had a solar panel and a battery. You know what? The fact that it was only going to be sunny for 3 hours, in December, but this happened in the summer, so they'd have the whole summer. But the fact that there was only 3 hours that would work in December, that 3 hours is better than 0.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a topical note to close on, Amy, because October 19th, we're getting a new federal budget. You've got your Biden administration's commitment. It's $2 trillion commitment. What we're going to see, and we'll get the details on it, it will be the biggest investment in the economy in a generation and the biggest investment in clean infrastructure. We'll get the details. One thing we know for sure is our federal government has committed $1 billion to building out Canada's electricity grid, and the tie they're putting on it is specifically for renewables, and renewables have grid stabilization services, i.e. storage. And if you don't come forward with a project with storage, you won't qualify for any of that federal funding. But I want to thank you, Amy, so much. We know how busy you are. Great to reconnect via Energy versus Climate. We had a terrific conversation, and we're very, very grateful for your time today.
Thank you for having me. Great to see you all.
All right. Quick reminders. Our next episode, April 22nd, Forecasts and Models with Ken Caldera. Ken is a climate scientist at the Carnegie Institution for Science. We've touched upon some of those themes today, so looking forward to that. Give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. We'll see you all in a couple weeks' time. And thanks again, Amy. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keefe, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Wojnicescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.